Welcome, folks. If you're joining us, we'll get started in just a couple minutes. I want to give everybody a chance to log in that has registered for the program today. All right, it is 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and that is when our program is scheduled to begin. We do only have, it looks like 3 individuals in the audience right now. We will go ahead and move forward with the webinar, if only to get it recorded so that we can put it up on our YouTube channel for those folks who maybe were interested who weren't able to make it today. But since we're a small group, feel free to type questions into the Q&A as we go throughout, and we'll be sure to answer those questions. My name is Alyssa Vincent, and I am the residential horticulture agent at the Manatee County Extension Office. And I just wanted to take a quick second to introduce kind of what Extension is and a little bit about our program, and then I'm going to hand off the presentation to Amy Stripe, who is one of our Master Gardener volunteers. If you're not familiar with Extension, we are a function of the Land Grant University system. This means that we work with the University of Florida as well as FAMU here in the state of Florida. The Extension service is a national service. There are land grant universities in every state in the country. And the mission of the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, which is where we are housed at the university, is to develop knowledge in agricultural, human, and natural resources, and to make that knowledge accessible to sustain and enhance the quality of human life. And so really what we do is we work with the researchers at the university. They give us information, we distill it, make it applicable, and design programs for our communities that will address needs right here in Manatee County. And so through that effort, we have many different extension agents who whose roles are to kind of address different needs within the community. As I said, I'm in residential horticulture. We also have commercial horticulture agents. We have a livestock agent, marine fisheries and coastal resources agent. We have folks who work specifically with the family and nutrition program. And so we really do touch on every aspect of people's lives. And you can see here some of our impacts to Manatee County from 2019. We'll be updating this with our 2020 impacts here at the end of the year. We save millions of gallons of water every year to Manatee County utilities customers, mainly through landscape retrofit programs. Our 4-H program reaches on average 28,000 youth every year. We provide millions of dollars in value to pesticide license holders. And also we provide value, $860,000 last year in volunteer time. And a lot of that, the majority of it really does come from our Master Gardener volunteer program, who Amy Stripe is one of our Master Gardener volunteers. And what that program is all about is just training an elite group of individuals who can go out into the community and answer horticultural questions and provide folks with good advice on how to kind of make sound decisions in their landscape. And so that's what we are all about. And today you are going to be learning about cold protection, which we do have another front coming through today, but it's not going to get as chilly as the last one. So yay, that's good for our plants. But Amy's going to talk to you all about how you can keep your landscape protected, and we will go ahead and move on from there. So Amy, I'm going to go ahead and let you share your screen.
Am I up?
Go ahead and hit play from start. There we go, all set.
Great, super, thank you. Thanks, Alyssa. I've been a Manatee County Master Gardener volunteer for the last 12 years. And as a fairly newly minted Master Gardener, I lived through the some record-breaking cold weather we had. And it was an abject lesson to me in terms of cold hardiness. With our landscape plants. I mean, I think here in Florida, we do stretch that we do push that cold tolerance envelope with our landscape plants all the time. Now, the outlook for this winter is fairly mild, but it never hurts to be prepared. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is preparing your landscape. So this is a picture that I took back in the spring of, I think it was early April of 2010. This is a picture here in Manatee County in Palmetto. And this gives a good, sort of a good example of different things that happen with cold damage in landscapes. So of course, the coconut palm, that's the tree in the foreground, looks like it took a real beating. But if you look at the oak tree that's on the right in the sort of middle background there, you can see a green ground cover. I'm assuming that's probably turf grass that is nice and green underneath that coconut, or that the oak tree. And then look at the landscape plants up against that structure in the background. So those are examples of microclimatic conditions that can be present in the same landscape that can either offset or worsen the cold damage you have. And we'll talk about microclimates at length in a minute here. So today we're going to talk about that winter of 2009 and 2010. And then the follow-up of December of 2010, all of those record-breaking cold events here in Florida. We will talk about understanding cold and its impacts on landscape plants, and then how to prevent cold damage through plant selection, placement, and care, and then what to do before and after cold damage. So I'm guessing this is about a 45-minute presentation today. So this winter of 2009-2010, I don't know how many of you were here for that. This chart will show you the minimum average temperatures in degrees of Fahrenheit at the Sarasota Bradenton Airport. You can see the blue line shows the normal, is normal minimum average temperatures. The red line is the actual minimum average temperatures from that November through March. And then the green line is the lowest temperatures we had in that period. So you can see that beginning in November, we were already dropping into the 40s for our lowest temperatures. By January, we were hitting under 30 degrees. And it didn't get much better as we progressed through March. The biggest problem, I think, with that particular event was the fact that it was 12-day, one day after another. We had 11 consecutive nights where minimum temperatures, sustained temperatures, were below 40 degrees Fahrenheit at the airport. Now, when we say sustained temperature, we mean that it stays at that temperature for 3 to 4 hours consecutively. So it was pretty brutal. It was basically an abnormal winter for us. It took its toll on our landscape plants, took its toll on wildlife, and also commercial growers were hit pretty hard. Now these photos that I'm about to show you, I took in a neighborhood in Palmetto in early April of 2010, after all this cold weather had gone through. It's important that you keep in mind, or remember, this is in zone 9B. I'm going to talk about cold hardiness zones in a minute and what that means, but this is 9B, so keep that number in your head. This is Coca loba uvifera. This is sea grape. Sea grapes are semi-deciduous in Florida, depending on where they are. In other words, they should have dropped, many or all of their leaves in the wintertime, but this is April. and it should have had all new growth on here by now. So this shows how brutal that cold weather was that year. Now, this is a row of coconut palms here. Again, they look pretty bad. A coconut palm is a tropical palm, so really doesn't belong in this part of Florida. If you look at those cabbage palms there on the left, they look really fine. They're very cold tolerant. They're very happy. Now, we thought we were out of the woods after this cold weather went through, and you still see some green fronds on those coconuts. But interestingly enough, 2, 3, 4, 6 months down the line, we were losing these. These were failing. They were dying. And what we surmised had happened was that the spear leaf, the spear is that newest unopened frond on a palm. We surmised that the base of that, which is highly, highly cold sensitive on a palm, sustained some frost damage. And then subsequent to that, a bud rot set in when it thawed and rotted that growing point or that apical meristem of the palm. And so literally from one day to the next, the dang thing just fell out. The top of those things were toppling off. So we lost a lot of coconut palms in this neighborhood. This is the same neighborhood. The lovely brown and gray shrubs in here are actually hibiscus. We lost some of those, not all of them died. Hibiscus is one of those things that can take a beating and come back. It doesn't look very good when it's doing it, but that was coming back. Now this in the foreground here, that is actually agapanthus, which is also called lily of the Nile. Obviously a lot more cold hardy than those hibiscus. And then in the center background here is a royal palm. It took a lot of chill damage there. We didn't lose any of those, the royal palms, but they did take quite a hit with desiccating winds. These are crevalle jacks. We had quite a massive fish kill in the Manatee River and the harbors associated with the river. We had losses of a lot of snook, mullet, other fish. In fact, I think that there was a moratorium in 2010 on snook fishing because the stock was way, way down. We'd lost so many fish. And boy, did this stink. Let me tell you something. This was amazing. And then as if to add insult to injury, December rolled around for 2010, and it was the coldest December on record. The average temperature for the 1st to the 30th of December, you can see here in Jacksonville, was 46.1 degrees Fahrenheit, which was almost 9 degrees colder than average. You can see in Tallahassee, it was 9 degrees below average. In Orlando, 11 degrees below average. Tampa, St. Pete area, where I live, 10 degrees below average. And then in Miami, 8 degrees below average. So that was another big cold event that happened within the same year. And it was just devastating to landscapes. Before we talk about preparing for cold weather, I think it's important to understand the different types of cold weather that we get because your preparations are going to differ. So we use that term frost and freeze kind of interchangeably, but in fact, they are different things. A radiational freeze, that's the technical term for a frost, that typically occurs on calm, clear nights when the temperatures drop to freezing or below and the heat radiates from the surfaces of objects in the environment as it cools down. So that's why it's called radiational freeze. The height of the cold air mass it varies widely, but it's usually no deeper than about 200 feet, 30 to 200 feet or so. And then you get a hoarfrost, which is where atmospheric moisture actually forms ice crystals on the surface of objects and leaves and things like that. If it's dry enough and you don't have moisture, you get no ice crystals, it's something called an air frost or a black frost. Frost can occur even when the ambient temperature, it feels, significantly warmer. So you might walk out the door, it's 40 degrees, you're like, this isn't freezing. But at ground level, you're going to have the 32 degrees for there to be a frost. So this is kind of what it looks like. So this sort of gold band here represents a warm air layer. The dark blue band represents the cold air layer. And you get what's called an inversion, where of course warm air rises and cold air sinks. And so you have, you have a loss of that warm air layer at the ground level. Now you can successfully protect plants from frost by reducing that radiant heat loss. Now, Mother Nature can help us out in a couple of circumstances when we are faced with possible frosts. If we have, for example, a clear, breezy night, what happens is the warm ground radiates the heat back into the open sky, and then the winds mix up the warm air with the cool air, so it prevents it from reaching freezing temperatures. Another instance is if it's a cloudy night. So the warm ground, again, radiates the heat away into the sky, the clouds absorb that heat, and then they reflect it back or radiate it back down to the ground so that the surface air is not chilled. Now, an advective freeze, on the other hand, is literally what we call a freeze. And that is also sometimes called a frontal freeze or a frontal wind. And what happens here, it can be much more damaging to plants. A cold air mass suddenly moves into the area. It's usually windy, sometimes it's cloudy. The plants do not get a chance to become acclimated to the dropping temperatures because it happens so fast. So that makes them more susceptible to damage. They're usually, like I said, they're usually accompanied, at least in Florida, by very punishing winds, very high winds. And then the depth of that cold air mass, 500 to 5,000 feet, means there is no warm air aloft. So there's no chance of getting any mixing of warm air with that cold air. It's just, there's nothing up there. So the protection becomes much, much more difficult. And this is kind of graphically what that looks like. So you can see the plant temperature is warmer than the air, but that wind, that cold, dry wind is moving through there and it's just whipping that heat away and disappearing. So a hard freeze is, sometimes we call it a ground freeze. Now this is where the ground surface is frozen solid underfoot. Heavy ice may be present. You have to have about, at a minimum, 28 to 30 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 to 4 consecutive hours, or temperatures at freezing for consecutive days, for day after day after day. It can cause root systems to be frozen. It's a pretty rare event, a hard freeze or ground freeze in South Florida, for example, but keep in mind that containers will be vulnerable. So it's almost like the container equivalent of a hard freeze or ground freeze can occur because the roots and the soil that those roots are in are exposed in pots. This is a National Weather Service map that shows you the number of days with minimum temperature at or below freezing that you're likely to have in your part of Florida. So you can see in extreme South Florida, less than a day or never. In the great bulk of the Central Florida, 1 to 10 days, and then it jumps to 11 to 20 days as we move further north. By the time you get up to Tallahassee, it's more than 30 days likely for a hard freeze to happen. So how does freezing impact plants? A lot of plants can adapt to ice formation on the surface, like with a radiational freeze or frost. But once their tissues, the cells inside their tissues get frozen, when they thaw out, they typically will fail. They will die. Probably the most damaging effect of cold is desiccation, however, I would have to say, at least here in Florida. It's basically drawing out of like the leaf tip or the whole of entire leaf itself during these high dry winds. And it can also happen on very sunny days. The combination of the sun and the wind basically is, zapping all the moisture out of that plant faster than it can absorb water, or even faster than it can transport water, especially because it might be experiencing some root problems with the cold weather. So roots and fruits have very little ability to adapt to the cold. Again, you will see that they're probably the first things to drop in any cold weather would be fruits and roots. And the other thing to keep in mind on certain plants, like tropical plants, you can get something called chill damage. And that's that bottom picture there of the palm tree, the little palm leaflets. that occurs in the absence. Does not involve freezing temperatures. It could happen anywhere from like 35 degrees up to almost 59 degrees. You can get what we call chill damage on plants that are put where they don't belong, i.e. in a colder area. One thing I want to say about the middle picture, that turf grass picture, you may not want to wait till the spring to kind of determine what damage you've had on your turf grass. And one way to figure that out is to pull plugs, dig up some plugs of grass, make sure you get as many roots as you can, plant those plugs in a container or containers, put them in a warm place and see if it resprouts. And if it does, then that's good news. It means your lawn's probably going to come back. So, so how do you prepare for cold damage? Well, the very first step, of course, is prevention, obviously. And the most important preventative step is to understand which plants are suited for the temperatures in your area. So know your zone. Back in 1960, the USDA divided the country into 11 geographical zones, numbered them, and they show the average minimum temperatures you can expect in each of those geographical areas. In Florida, we have zones 8 through 11. You can see that as the zone number goes up, the minimum temperatures also go up. Now, why is this important? This is important because this helps you determine what plants you want to put in your zone. When you go to a nursery, typically your plant will have a label on it. It'll say USDA zones or cold hardiness zones or what have you, and it will give you a range. If you pick up a plant and it says it's cold hardy for zones 9 to 10, you do not want to plant it in 8. That means that that plant cannot withstand, is not going to be able to withstand 10 to 20 degrees of temperature sustained for 4 hours, okay? You can plant it, but be prepared for it to be damaged or be prepared to lose it. So Manatee County, where I live right here, we have 2 zones. This is Manatee County. We have zone 9B and we have zone 10A. As you get closer to the coast, the weather gets warmer. So we have 2 zones here for Manatee County. Keep that in mind. Now, how do you use that zone data? A couple of weeks ago, I had a customer ask me what palm trees would be suitable or cold hardy for Manatee County. So I went to University of Florida, a publication called Ornamental Palms for Central Florida. And I just picked up here for illustration purposes, the first 4 alphabetically by scientific name that had hardiness zones that would be appropriate for us. So remember that I said we're a 9B and a 10A. So the Perotis palm is hardy 9A to 11A. So it's even more cold hardy than it needs to be for Manatee County. The same thing for the dwarf sugar palm. Now the blue Hesper palm and the Pendo palm are even more cold hardy. So they're good for 8 to 10. Now this works both ways. It works both with cold and it works with heat. So if you are looking at a plant, let's say a nasturtium comes to mind. Nasturtiums are usually rated for zones 4 through 8. So that means that you can probably get away with planting nasturtiums in Manatee County 9B to 10A during the winter when it's cooler, but during the hot summer we have here, those nasturtiums are they're not going to live. They're going to die. So that's why this cold hardiness index does work really well for you both ways. So going back to those photos that I showed you from Palmetto, the cold damage in that neighborhood, you can see why that sea grape was not happy at all. He was planted in he or she was planted in a 9B, and sea grapes are really cold hardy. To the lowest temperature sustained is 30 degrees Fahrenheit. The coconut palm is even less cold hardy than the sea grape. I mean, it's a 10B to 11. Now your hibiscus, okay, 9B, not a lot of those were killed, but hibiscus is one of those plants, it's highly sensitive to changes in temperature, among other things. And so if the temperature even drops from, say, like 85 to 80, sometimes you'll see hibiscus gets angry. It gets yellow leaves, it drops leaves, it doesn't kill it or anything, but it just gets angry. And that hibiscus was planted in a north-facing parking lot. So that kind of exacerbated the damage. The royal palm, I think I mentioned, we didn't lose any royal palms, but we did see quite a bit of desiccated, burnt-looking fronds on that. So let's take another look at ranges, cold hardness ranges. Sometimes you will see plants designated as North Central or South Florida cold hardy. This typically is really based on chill accumulations, which is important for fruit production. But sometimes in some publications from the University of Florida, you'll see North Central and South used. Some nurseries will use North Central and South. So here's an example. I just randomly picked a publication from the university on azalea cultivars. And you can see here, all three of these cultivars are good for the north part of the state. Duke de Rohan is suitable for Central Florida. I think you would probably not be happy with any of these in South Florida. It's probably just too hot for it. So once you've selected your plants based on cold hardiness zones, now you want to fine tune their placement within your yard. So that gets into the topic of microclimates. What are the climatic conditions around your house, and why is this important in determining where to place your plants? So, you're going to find, depending on the orientation, for example, of your house, you're going to have a warmer and colder area in your yard. So south is going to be the warmest, of course. The second warmest will be the west facing. The third warmest will be the east. And then, of course, the coldest zone and the moistest zone, by the way, will be north. This illustration here also points out slopes, because cold air does sink. So it's important to understand if you have sort of like depressed areas or swales or things like that in your yard, and to identify those. Another factor affecting plant placement is going to be the sun and shade pattern. Now, shaded areas, may suffer more intense cold damage, especially turf grasses, or plants that really require full sun, obviously. Shade prevents the normal daytime, heating up of the area, so it will retain cold temperatures longer. So keep that in mind when you're thinking of cold tender plants. You don't want to place them in shady spots necessarily. One thing that is really important, though, is there is shelter that is provided by overhangs from structures, tree canopies, even shrubs can provide a little bit of radiational freeze protection by keeping that warm air, down. As you saw in that very first picture that I showed you with the coconut palm and that green grass under that oak tree, in contrast to the dried out and dead grass around it, that illustrates how the canopy of a tree can help protect. Do keep in mind, of course, that the sun moves around. So in the wintertime, it's going to be lower, higher in the summertime. Also during the day, walk around your house several times a day and see how many hours of sun or shade you're getting in various parts of the yard. The other thing also to keep in mind is that as trees get bigger and shrubs get bigger, the amount of shade they're providing is going to change. Yet another factor affecting plant placement is surface reflectivity. So if you have like a cold sensitive citrus tree, like shown in this picture, you might want to put it up against impervious structures like masonry or pavement. Masonry and pavement, they absorb less heat during the day, but they lose it really quickly at night. That's what it indicates there with the long rays. There's less energy stored, whereas soil and grass stores more energy, but releases it more slowly. There's, other microclimatic factors include elevation, cold air sinking. This little illustration shows the cold air going, flowing downhill. Believe it or not, as little as 4 feet
difference in elevation can lower your temperature by 5 degrees. I mean, that's a difference of like between a 9B and a 10A. I mean, that is 5 degrees can make a huge difference. If you're near a body of water, if you have a retention pond, a lake, if you're at the beach or near seaside, if you are on a river, that will help to protect your landscape from cold, because water does absorb, does store more radiational heat than soil does. And then lastly, if your soil is poorly drained or compacted, you might have a shallow root system as a result with your landscape plants, which is going to be weaken it and make it more susceptible to cold injury. Okay, so we've discussed plant selection in terms of cold hardiness and plant placement. So the third leg on our prevention stool, if you will, is going to be plant care. So, optimally, you want to have well-balanced, sufficiently nutritious nutrient plants throughout the year. And the reason why we say that is because you really do not want to fertilize in the late fall if you've got a nutritional deficiency. By doing so, you can easily set up a flush of new growth, which is what you do not want coming into cold weather. That's very vulnerable to cold damage. So you want to regularly fertilize throughout the year. I made a note here outside of our N bans, because here in Manatee County, at least, we do have a nitrogen ban during the summer months. And obviously you want to apply per the label instructions. Now keep in mind, of course, again, that in the wintertime, plants tend to slow down or go dormant, so they have less nutritional needs. So that's another reason why you want to avoid fertilizing late in the fall. Pruning, again, for the very same reason as the fertilization issue, you do not want to be pruning tropical and semi-tropical plants in, right now. You want to have done that, months ago, because you don't want that flush of new growth that comes as a result of pruning. Deciduous plants can be pruned out because they're going to go dormant anyway, drop their leaves, so that's not that big of an issue. You also want to be out there routinely scouting for pest, insect, and disease damage, because that will also weaken your plant if there is a pest problem, making it more susceptible to the cold damage. So now you've done your homework on the three P's, I call it, of prevention. So plant care, plant selection, and plant placement. So now let's just say cold weather's coming, which it is, and you want to take some additional steps. So the first thing you want to do is to water thoroughly. This includes your beds, your lawns, your containerized plants, outdoor potted plants. Well-watered soil does absorb more heat than dry soil. So that's the reason for that. And then what happens is, as the temperatures fall and things cool down, that heat gets released that's been stored. Also, it helps protect if we have those desiccating winds. If you've got a well-irrigated landscape, that will help ameliorate a little bit of that effect of those desiccating high winds. Now, plants in containers can be relocated. You can smush them together, like you can see in that far left photo. That helps reduce heat loss by doing that. You can all place them under an overhang, like the middle picture shows there, that will afford some degree of cold protection. Or you can put it up against a structure, like the picture on the far right, because that will be a lot more protected than if that plant were just left out in the open air and exposed to that cold weather. If we're going to have an advective freeze, bring your containers indoors if you can. Now, what to do before a freeze? You want to cover sensitive plants. We say plastic, don't use it. The reason for that is because if any of your foliage is touching the plastic, the heat that's stored in that foliage transfers out onto the plastic and can cause damage on your foliage. Paper is ideal, cloth is ideal. You need to cover all the way to the ground. The idea is to trap that radiant heat within, around that plant. You can use, you can improvise. Look at this little seedling here, has a empty soda bottle, on top of it to help protect it. You can use cardboard boxes, garbage bins, buckets, whatever's at hand that can completely encase the plant, is the idea. And then of course you do want to remove any covering the following day when the sun comes up, it starts warming up a little bit. On young trees, you can wrap trunks with in paper or cloth or burlap, something like that. You want to wrap it from the lowest branches down all the way to the ground. Now, in the case of palms, it doesn't work. Palms are not trees. And palms, depending on the part of the palm, it is either more or less cold sensitive. Of course, flowers and fruit are the most cold sensitive on a palm. And then the root system is next. That base of that spear leaf is next. The least cold sensitive part of a palm, thank goodness, is the apical meristem, the bud, the growing point. So that's the least cold sensitive, but don't bother wrapping trunks of palm trees. You can add heat. Hanging Christmas lights works, but it has to be the old-fashioned incandescent bulb. LED doesn't put out any heat. The fiber optic guys don't put out any heat. It has to be incandescent. And believe it or not, leaving on like porch lights, outdoor lights, landscape lights does help add a degree or two of heat. And sometimes that's the only difference you need, the difference between freezing and not freezing. So during an advective freeze where we usually have winds, you can create windbreaks. And this little picture down here shows, this is the windbreak here. And it shows where the obstructions can block airflow up to 3 times their height. So like if you're looking at this little garden bench here, picture 3 times the height of that garden bench, and that will protect any plants up to that height behind it. Now it's important that you don't use solid surfaces for windbreaks. And the reason for that is because sometimes it can create like a funnel. It can cause the wind to funnel and get turbulent, and then it will spill over onto the lee side with strong downdrafts. So it's got to be something that's a little bit, has a little bit of openness to it, not a solid structure. Now, in the event of a radiational freeze, just the opposite. You want to encourage air circulation. Remember that mixing of the warm and the cool air. That's what you want to try to get to avoid freezing. So you want to be free of clutter, free of debris, brush, that type of thing. You want lots of space between plants to encourage whatever little puff of air you're going to have to mix around. Commercial growers, interestingly, use big fans sometimes to get that air circulation. I've even read of cases where they use helicopters from up above to get that warm air aloft back down to the ground. I don't think you want to try that for your yard though. Good. So to sum up what to do before a freeze, you want to water thoroughly, relocate container plants, cover sensitive plants, wrap the trunks of young trees. You can add heat. In advective freezes, you can create windbreaks, and believe me, that works very, very well. Even a piece of lawn furniture works as a great windbreak. You want to ensure adequate air circulation in the event of radiational freeze. Okay. Now, here's what not to do before a freeze. We're racing ahead of time here, so we're good on time. Sprinkling. I know you guys have all seen on the news, you see the reports on the news where strawberry growers are covering their plants in a insulating kind of layer of ice. Not very practical for a homeowner. It requires precision timing. You have to start this. You got to start the sprinkling the minute the temperature reaches freezing, and then you have to continue that until it's completely thawed out. In the event of, if you have several consecutive days where the temperature is freezing, you might overwater. If you keep up that sprinkling, you're going to overwater. And it really doesn't work well, if at all, when the temperature reaches like 24 degrees. So sprinkling, not practical. Fire. smudge pot type things. Fire, in addition to being kind of a safety hazard, does create it. What it does is it sucks in cold air from the surrounding area. It attracts cold air. That's not what you're trying to do. You're trying to warm up the air. Chemicals, as far as I know personally, I do not believe there's any science behind any of the, there's some, at retail, there's some sprays available, spray your foliage, it protects it from cold. I haven't seen anything that says that that actually works. Mulch is an interesting kind of conundrum, actually. Moist, bare soil does absorb and store heat longest. So if you're going to have, like you're expecting several consecutive days of cold, the application of mulch is not going to do much. If you're expecting like just an overnight event, like one night, yes, you can apply extra mulch to help keep that radiant heat from escaping. But perhaps the best rule of thumb is just don't apply extra mulch and expect it to really help much. And then really don't overprotect. The truth is that a lot of plants will harden up if they are exposed to cold weather, especially if it's not an advective type of freeze. They will harden up. I'm a lazy gardener. I don't protect anything. I mean, I might bring in a container that's outside if I know it's cold sensitive, but I kind of let them, do their deal. I mean, I try very hard to get the appropriate plant for my zone, but if it's out of my control, for example, I don't really try to protect it much and try to get it to harden up on its own. So what to do after a freeze? You want to remove covers immediately once the temperature starts getting up there. The last thing you want to do is to create like a mini greenhouse under those covers, because that will encourage new growth. And until we're out of the woods, cold weather wise, you really want to make sure that you get those covers off of there. You don't want new growth coming along. You might have to see to watering needs, especially if we've had one of those desiccating wind events associated with the cold weather. You might have to go out and water stuff. And really don't prune right now. I mean, be very patient. As ugly as dead and burnt looking leaves look, believe it or not, they do help insulate. They do help to trap warm air. And you may be surprised at how little damage you have at the end of the day. So you don't want to prune until you know for sure that it's actually something dead that needs to be removed. So for ornamental grasses, you want to cut them down to a few inches just before new spring growth, before you expect new spring growth. For turf grass, you're probably going to want to mow even before some new growth sets up, because you want to get weeds under control, and it's a really appropriate time to fertilize also mid-spring. On palms, if you have any green at all, and for that matter, yellow, in any of the fronds, including on the midrib, leave it on the palm. Do not remove it. Even if it's got leaflet tips are desiccated and dried, if there's any green whatsoever, there's still nutrition in those leaves to supply the palm. Perennials, wait until the new growth has emerged, and again, remove only the dead stuff. And you can do the old scratch the bark test with your fingernail. If it's green underneath, you're good to go. Don't cut it off. And then of course for annuals, if they're dead, you want to remove them and replace them with seasonal appropriate, type of plants. So I believe that's it. Boy, we raced through that. There is a ton of information on cold protection, effects of cold, etc., on the University of Florida's electronic data information system. If you go to you can just Google UFLEDIS if you want, or you can go to that URL. There's a little search box in the upper right on that homepage, and just type the word cold, and it will give you a list of a number of publications on cold protection and effects of cold. A lot of them are for commercial people, but it makes for good reading anyway, for citrus growers and stuff like that, but it's very, very interesting.
Or you can always consult, your Extension Master Gardener volunteers. We operate a plant clinic at Extension. You can reach us by phone. You can come in person. You can email us. We're there every weekday except Wednesday from 9 to 4 o'clock. So we're there to help you that way as well. So that's all I have. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. I know it's really close to Christmas and people are anxious to do other stuff. Their minds are on other things, but have a good holiday.
All right, thanks all. I'm not seeing any questions. We will go ahead and conclude the webinar for today. Have a nice day.
Thank you.